So here we are with Bill Ante.
Yes.
Been a butcher for 17 years, a Red Cliff member, and he's going to show us a little bit about how to work with venison and cutting it away from the bone and working with the meat. So Bill, I'm just going to watch you do what you do.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Basically what we're dealing with today is a hind quarter of a venison, and I guess we'll just go through a few of the step-by-step procedures, how I usually take it down and tear it down, and just to give you an idea of how it gets cut up.
Great.
Basically, I guess first thing you want to start with is try and get a sharp knife. This particular one is it's called a 6-inch curved boning knife. It's a pretty versatile, all-around, semi-flexible handle. Sharper the better. Steel just to bring your edge back.
Where can I find one of those knives?
You know, I think you could get them pretty much around here I'm not sure. You might have to go online or through a catalog or any meat supply outfit, or even you could probably get it through like Chicago Cutlery or any of those, really. I think you could find them.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, you've got, one of the first things I usually do is I'll usually stand it on end, and the first thing I cut off is what you would call a tip, a sirloin tip. Basically, a venison has the same bone structure and muscle structure as a beef. Very similar in that regard. And the first thing I usually do is I'll cut in right to the bone and try and just follow it along. And it gets to a point where you're going to hit, there's a knuckle in there, and then I'll just bring it straight out from there. And that's basically your tip right there.
Oh, wow.
And then there's two other pieces. There's a top or an inside round, and then a bottom or an outside round. There's a little bit, this would be the rump roast. There's a shank here, and there's also a piece in here called a heel. And if I can, this meat is a little bit stiff yet. Maybe what I'll do is let this sit for a few minutes and we'll just worry about the tip. The first thing I usually do is there's a silver skin and a cap, and I'll just peel that off. And really there's not much use for all that's going to do is just gum up your grinder, and it's not really going to have a lot of use. But there is some other meat in here you could save for stew meat or for trim for grinding hamburger. But really the fat on the venison is not very desirable. I would not recommend grinding it. Try and get as much of it off as possible. And then everyone's got a little bit of different way of doing it, but how far down you clean for your trim, how good you get it is your preference and up to you. Oh, I see. So we'll just, some of the trim meat we'll just save aside for grinding. Like I say, if you get a good solid muscle with not a lot of silver skin or sinew or gristle, you could certainly save it for stew meat, something like that. And then, like I say, when you get a nice little piece like that, you can sure just cube it up, say for like stew meat. And then we could whittle away on some of this other stuff for grinding, just to kind of clean it up.
When you grind venison, do you ever grind just venison, or do you always mix it with a fattier meat?
Well, again, that's a matter of personal preference. Personally, I like to grind my venison with beef, ground beef, and I know a lot of people will use pork shoulder, pork fat, beef fat, but what we like to do is we'll grind it right with beef, even ground beef. Sometimes you can find ground, well, maybe not right now, but ground beef sometimes on sale, and we'll grind it right with ground beef. And and it'll be, you know, to the point where you can't hardly even tell the difference anymore. But I know a lot of people prefer to use pork, beef fat, pork fat. Even I've heard of people that'll grind bacon with it, and they say it makes a fantastic burger.
I bet.
Yeah. Now, we're not going to get too particular, and you start whittling away too much here, you don't really have a whole lot to work with anyway. So, again, it's how particular you want to be with your trim. I think we got most of that. So this would be kind of just waste. Now on the tip, I'll usually clean it up a little bit, take the silver skin off. It's all that basically is. It's a connective tissue that really, again, I don't prefer it. I wouldn't recommend even leaving it on. I know some people do, but I just like to get it off.
Is that what sometimes imparts the gaminess flavor, or is it only the blood?
You know, I don't know if it's so much the gaminess as it is the chewiness or toughness, but I don't think so much the gaminess. And this skin on this tip is pretty thin, so you could actually even put this into your grindings, and that's not really going to hurt a thing.
Great.
This could go right into your trim bowl, that's not a problem. Now, as far as the tip goes, let me clean that up underneath just a little bit too. You could leave this, certainly leave this whole just as a roast, would be perfectly fine. Some people put like string butcher twine across it, you know, to get it a little tighter. You certainly wouldn't have to do that, but it's perfectly fine just like this for preparation. Or if you prefer steaks, a lot of times I'll just square it off and then I'll just save that first one again for stew meat. And then I'll just, you know, kind of slice it down 1/2 inch, 3/4, whatever you really prefer.
Great, yeah, those look beautiful.
Some like prefer a little thinner, some a little thicker. When you're cutting meat too, like in your steaks, I know a lot of people, you get the temptation to cut it and slice it like a loaf of bread, where you grab the whole piece and then cut off. Ideally, what you should do to get more uniform pieces is to grab the piece you're actually cutting off. So we only want this one, so you get a better control of what you're cutting if you're only touching the one you want.
Fantastic.
And then when you get to the end, you can make a little steak, or you could put that in the stew, or whatever.
Just a little
Yeah.
taste.
Yep. So basically, that's the tip.
Great. And is freezing, or when you freeze steaks versus stew meat or meat for grinding, is there anything special that you do or different than you would if you were to freeze a roast?
Sometimes, when we'll freeze, a lot of times, I don't know if in the supermarket, if you ever go to the deli counter, and you'll get like a 1/2 pound of ham or something, and they'll grab that plastic deli wrap. We'll put that deli wrap between our steaks and then fold it over and then put our butcher paper, freezer paper over that. That way they kind of pull apart a little more uniformly, and you don't get a lot of the blood coming out, you know, in your packaged meat. It'll stay kind of inside there. Well, like I say, usually we'll have that deli paper, but it's certainly not mandatory. We just use a freezer paper like you have here, shiny side up, and I guess depending on what size packages you want to freeze in, I don't know, maybe we can try a couple of smaller ones here. I'll try it like that. And basically, what I do is I start with a corner of the paper, and I don't have a very big sheet here, maybe it's not even enough. with the long corner towards you, and then you flip that over first, and then you tuck in the side, and try and keep the paper straight off the edge. You will tuck in this side, and try and keep the paper so they're straight like that. And then you kind of fold it over, pull it towards you, fold it over, pull it towards you, fold it over, and then a piece of our tape. And that way you don't use a whole lot of paper, and it looks somewhat presentable.
And then, do you normally label these with anything specific, or the date that they're used, or the date that you made them?
Yeah, the date that we processed is the date that we usually
Okay.
put on the package. And they'll certainly keep in the freezer, I would certainly think no problem, 6 months, if not longer.
Excellent.
Okay, moving on with the hind, what we're going to try and do is take the inside or the top round off next. And basically, if you can see where our bone is, where we cut from the tip, and if we just cut in off that bone, again, this is a little bit stiff, but I'm hoping we can, and just kind of follow that bone.
This is where knowing the anatomy of deer, or if you're working with beef, really comes in handy, huh?
You bet. And then once you get it to a point, see how I'm just sort of pulling that away? With that muscle, that structure will tell me pretty much right where it is. And then you just pull it, keep trimming. Don't be afraid to give it a good pull, because it'll show you. And then just keep following that silver skin right around. And then that's the top round.
Wow.
We'll leave this here a little bit and we'll move on to this one. Again, trim it as you see fit. Again, I pull all that skin off. I just don't even like to deal with it.
And what's the best way to get rid of maybe the fat you're working with right now? What's the best way to get rid of that? Just to compost it, or throw it away, or feed it to the dogs?
Dogs, birds, yeah, you bet. I'm sure every dog in the neighborhood would love that. Again, I'm just trimming off a little bit of age that came from the freezer, that's all.
Okay, and so that age, is it a darker color than the? Okay.
Generally, yeah, you can tell just by eyeballing it that it's got a little.
And so, with that in mind, when someone gives you maybe some venison from a deer they've killed recently, what are some good ways to know that it's still good and fresh, or that it's been taken care of properly?
Well, I guess most people that do hunt do know how to take care of their deer when they shoot it. Of course, quickly as possible, depending on the time of year. Of course, if you shoot one early in the season, it's going to be warm out. You're going to want to, of course, gut it as soon as possible and get the hide off it as soon as possible so it cools down. It's not so critical as the season goes on and it gets colder and colder to get the hide off right away. One thing, if you're not going to process it right away and you pull a hide off, it will dry out in a relatively quick period of time, a couple days, and it's going to be pretty dry on the surface. And a lot of that would have to be trimmed off. So ideally, if you could get the hide off and then process it shortly thereafter, that would be the best way.
Okay.
Yep. I like to square off just a little bit here too, just to make it a little more uniform. And we'll use this other piece just for trimmings or stew meat, because it's a nice solid muscle.
And if somebody wanted to make, instead of ground venison jerky, but jerky from cuts from the meat, is there a particular particular cut that would be better for that?
For jerky, yes. If depending on your jerky you're making, if you're gonna make like a ground jerky that's extruded, through those stuffers that you see all over, then it still would be better to get cuts that aren't full of the seam, that silver seam, or like heels or shanks that have a lot of tendons in them. It will work, but it's not as desirable as something with more of a solid muscle and not so much of the seam.
Okay. And then for venison that's not made from ground venison, is there a particular cut that might
Yeah, this top would be perfect for that. And you'll see when we cut it, again, you could use this just as a roast, just as it is, or steak it up, or if you could put it, even like if you had access to a slicer, you could put it on a slicer for jerky meat, because then you'd get some nice thin uniform slices. Or you can do the best you can with a knife too, and that's fine.
Absolutely.
Not a problem. But yeah, this would be perfect for that. Now that we've trimmed this up a little bit, there's really not a whole lot left on here as far as silver skin, just a tad here, and that's not very much. We're going to see for trim. Some of this, we can maybe get a little bit more off of here. Again, I just ask myself, would I want to eat it? If I think I wouldn't want that, it's full of hair or full of age, or if you full of dirt, or if it got drugged through. If you didn't want to eat it, I wouldn't process it. Just throw it away.
It's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. So then basically, again, we'll slice this into steaks just for presentation. You can kind of see how the grain of the meat runs this way, and of course you always try and slice against the grain. And we're just going to square it up. Let's save that for stew meat. And then I'll do that first one, and then again back to slicing, holding only the piece that you're cutting.
Let's see. Is there an average amount of meat that you get off of maybe a venison, or excuse me, a deer of a certain weight or height? Or?
Well, I think as far as a percentage of yield, it's not as much as a lot of people would think. There's between waist and bone and fat, I would say, really, I don't think you're going to be doing much better than 40%.
Okay.
Somewhere in that neighborhood, a little bit better, but certainly less than 50. So if you look at it that way, that's that's really not all that much.
Right.
Just put this in the stew meat. And this little guy here too. This is what we trimmed up earlier. This you could just put in the trim. There might be a little bit, if you wanted to play around and dig in there, you could probably come up with some stew meat too. Again, it's just a matter of how much you want to deal with it.
And for somebody who has put as much time into this as you have, this is pretty quick work. For someone who's pretty new at this, how long do you think that it would normally take, or how long did it take you when you first started?
Well, again, we're just dealing with a small piece of a deer here, but to really do a good job, it's gonna take you a few hours for sure, if not longer. And if you're just a novice just starting out, I would think you'd probably devote a good 4 hours or better into, if not longer. But a person that does it on a regular basis, I would think a couple, 3 hours, you should have a pretty good handle on it.
Great. And so while you're working on these cuts of meat, is there anything that that you should keep in mind? For instance, we have this bowl here that's on a bowl of ice to keep these trims cold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, temperature is important, as cold as possible, sure, because bacteria will grow after a time. But again, if it's not the early part of the season when it's still quite warm out, generally on your kitchen table or your workbench or whatever, you wouldn't have any problem with bacteria. Now we'll move on to the bottom round is basically just that left. We'll break that down a little bit once we get into it. But again, I just try and follow my knife around the bone, try not to dig in too deep, just to get it started. And again, it's just a matter of just trying it and trial and error. You really can't do anything wrong or hurt anything. I mean, don't hurt yourself. Just follow the bone structure and follow the muscle. Okay, now on the bottom round, there's also another piece here called the eye of round. Some people prefer to take it off. Some people will leave it on. Just for the point of demonstration, I suppose we could cut it off. And again, just keep following. You just keep pulling and it'll tell you where it's at. That's the eye. And this is what they call the heel of round right here. Now this mostly is just for grinding meat. There's quite a few tendons and seams in there, but you could, in theory, cut that and trim it up and use it for a roast, but it would be a little bit less desirable for sure. And there's a piece of, just again, for trim here. This little muscle here, some people will square that right off and put this with this. Other people will just trim it out of there. It's what they call the rump. This is a little smaller one, so it's not real big. Again, I would suggest probably just putting that into stew meat, or you could even slice it up for some steaks. We can try that too. But there's really not a real big muscle there. So all I'm going to do is just trim this up again, like we did before. Actually, put that in there, that's bad. Again, you can see a little bit of that age from the freezer on there.
Yeah, you can see it's a bit brown.
Yeah, exactly. That's something I don't really prefer not to have in there, I guess.
And is that age part of the meat also a bit softer than the
Well,
fresher?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe not. But
Okay, so it's really just using your eyes.
yeah, I'd say. Then we'll get in here and we'll trim the bottom side of this off too. Again, like I say, the fat on the venison, it's not really nothing I prefer, and I don't think most people do either.
Were there any things that you learned when you first started that maybe the way that you hold the meat, or maybe tips and tricks that kind of have helped you as you've moved along, maybe like securing the meat on the table so it's not running around?
Well, I guess it's more or less just like a trial and error kind of a thing. Whatever's comfortable to you, however you are comfortable with handling it. As far as, tricks, again, it's just a matter of trial and error. Just give it a shot.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're working with a hindquarter here, and so the other hindquarter would have the same cuts. Are there
Yep.
other cuts that would be on the front quarter?
Yes, the front shoulder, there's a fair amount of meat on it. There's a couple of cuts that you could save for roasts, but I'd say a lot of people though will just save the front quarters just for grinding meat, for putting in a sausage or a hamburger, what you prefer. But we used to save some of the front shoulder meat for roasts, and you certainly can, but majority of it I would say is grinding meat. And of course, and then you've got your back straps down the middle of the back of the animal. which we don't have today either. Those are about the easiest things to pull out. They just follow one on each side of the backbone. And there again, you've got the silver skin that you should really peel that off first. And then you can leave it in a roast or cut it into chops or butterfly it. There's some methods. You can try different things with that too. But those are usually your best cuts, and they go first.
Gotcha.
And there's also 2 small tenderloins on the inside cavity of the animal. And a lot of times right after you gut the deer, a lot of people will pull them out right away and consume them because they'll tend to dry out pretty fast. The air will get to them. So if you can pull them out right after gutting, put them in a bag, bring them home, that's pretty good eats right there.
And going back to the silver skin, you should be trimming this off before you freeze it, right? Or should you be trimming it off?
Nah, not necessarily. I mean, see, like the one we're dealing with today, the whole hind was frozen. Generally, we're processing this deer before it's even frozen.
Okay.
So in that case, yes, you would take all that silver skin off as you're processing it, and then you're done and it's in the freezer. But in this situation, the way we did it today, it's fine the way it was, just wrapped, and then you deal with it later. That doesn't hurt a thing.
Great.
Yeah. Again, now the bottom round, we're just gonna square this off, and again, back to the old famous stew meat. And then we're just gonna, again, you could leave this, you could slice this thin for jerky meat again, you could leave it as a roast whole, or you could do like we're doing right here and just cutting it up into steaks.
And I've seen some people freeze meat with in a plastic bag with a bunch of water in it, and so it'll freeze. It's kind of like a large ice cube. Is that a good method for maintaining quality?
Well, personally, I wouldn't prefer. I wouldn't advise to freeze it in water myself. I'm sure people have, and maybe they even swear by it. But it's not, to me. It's not like fish that you freeze in water. I don't personally know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about some of the organ meats? I know that some people will eat the heart and the liver. Is there any special way to preserve those in the freezer?
Again, I don't really think so. I think you just, as long as it's in freezer paper, I think organ meat hold up just fine that way.
Right.
When you do cut out the heart, what we like to do is we don't save it all the time, but we have in the past. You open it up and then you take out what's inside there, the ventricles or arteries, and then the main ones. And then as far as the liver goes, I think all you have to do is really cut it open and inspect it for, there used to be, years ago, there used to be like a parasite in there called a fluke, I think they called it, and it was kind of like a worm. But you don't have that. You don't hardly ever see that anymore. This little eye around, because it is such a small piece, a lot of times I will leave it attached, and then I'll just make all my steaks so they're with that attached. But we just cut it off for to show what it is. And I guess what we could do too is if we try to butterfly this and not, then it gets a little bit bigger anyway.
Okay.
It's basically just cutting down and not cutting down all the way, but most of the way.
Okay.
And then your next cut, and then you just sort of open it up.
So you just take the meat and you cut it down a part of the way.
Yep.
And then your next cut's going to cut all the way through.
Yep.
And then you'll just open
Just
that meat up.
open it up.
And is that good for maybe stuffing the meat? With
Sure, you could try that, absolutely.
What are
Yeah.
some other good things to use like a butterfly cut for?
Well, I think you just hit it on the head with the stuffing. That sounds like a great idea. We'll butterfly our chops a lot too, so you don't have a bunch of cuts about this big. You'll double them in size, and they make a better table fare, I think.
Great. And I know with some games such as raccoon and beaver, it's a good idea to bleed the meat in a solution of maybe it could be buttermilk or baking soda or things like that. Do you need to do that with venison?
I don't think you really need to. I'm not saying you couldn't, of course, but I don't really think it's necessary. And this was that little piece of rump we were dealing with. Again, by the time you clean it up and whittle everything out of it, there's not going to be a whole lot left here to work with. So I think what we'll do is we'll just put it into more of our stew meat. Again, if you're making jerky with the grinding type through the extruder, any of that stew meat would work perfect for that.
Okay.
There. This one I can get a little bit of trim out of. Again, with the heel, you wouldn't have to get too fancy with that. It's just a matter of opening it up, following the bone. Personally, I just put all that into grinding. I'm not saying, like I say, you certainly could. You could use it as a roll. Just trim that up a little bit better.
And what do you generally do? Do you know of anybody that works with the bones after they cut all the meat off it? What's generally done with those?
Well, we had a friend that actually used them for medicinal purposes,
Okay.
and how he processed them, I'm not exactly sure. I think they were boiled into like a soup. I had never tried it, but I remember giving him quite a few bones over the years, and that's what he did with them. Other than that, I mean, you could certainly, I guess you could boil them for stock. I've never tried it. If you got a little bit of meat left on the bones, I guess you certainly could do that. You could try it, see how it goes.
And if when you were giving these bones to your friend, did you treat the bones just like you did the meat by keeping it cold and they put it in the freezer?
And that's it. That's all. We just froze them and then gave them to him. Yep. And he took over from there. Basically, like I say, about all we're going to do with this is just put it into our trimmings.
And with stew meat as opposed to trimmings, is there a certain size that you generally like to look for stew meat?
Well, for stew meat, yeah, I suppose, inch cubes or maybe a little stronger depending on what you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as trimmings go, whatever your grinder will take.
Okay.
Some people have a nice big grinder, it'll take some awful big chunks. Some
Okay.
people have a small one, and you're going to have to maybe slice it pretty kind of small. I guess again, it's up to you. But I do know the less tendons and silver skin you have in it, the better your grinder's going to work.
Great.
And then all we have left is just a little bit of shank. And generally, this was cut above the hoof a ways. So they're generally a shank is probably going to be about maybe into here somewhere. So there'll be a little bit more meat on here usually. This one we're not going to get too fussy with. There's not a whole lot left on here anyway. And they are quite tendony. There's not a whole lot to them. I can certainly understand why it was cut the way it was. But as far as the round leg bone, I mean, you could get a little more picky on it if you want, but there's really not a whole lot there left to deal with. It's totally up to the individual processing. And this here, of course, like I say, if you wouldn't want that in your grinder, I wouldn't even deal with it. But we got a couple pieces here we can save. Okay,
Wow, that looks really great.
so I guess that's about it in a nutshell.
And so when you're wrapping up the steaks earlier, you said that you were folding it over and then you were pulling it tight, and that's to create a really nice seal around the meat?
Yeah, and it just makes, I mean, not that it really matters what the package looks like, but yeah, just try and get a little tighter seal.
Great, and that'll keep maybe the air and the moisture out to prevent it from freezer burn?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And are there any tips with marinating meat before maybe grilling it?
Well, it's always a good idea. I like marinated meats. Yeah, it seems like it breaks down the fibers and the tissues and makes it a lot more tender. Sure,
Great.
definitely. Yeah, good idea.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that when you're getting ready to butcher, that the table is already clean. Is there any anything that you normally use, like a bleach solution or anything?
A bleach solution, sure, before and after. Yeah, anything to keep that bacteria count down.
Okay.
But again, if you're gonna process, don't leave it on the table all day. Get it, once you start it, I would say just keep doing it till it's done, and then you won't have to worry about bacteria, really.
Great. So keep some ice on hand. Keep some containers to put the different cuts
Get
in.
it in the freezer as soon as you can. Yep,
That's
exactly.
great.
Yep,
And
common
is there
sense.
a bleach solution that you use, like a teaspoon per gallon, or?
Yeah, there's something to, back in the day, we used to have these pH strips. You dip in the water when it would change a certain color, but a capful will go a long way, so yeah, don't use too much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then I also noticed as you were going, you'd stop periodically and hone your knife. Could you just kind of feel that it needed a bit of honing, or?
Well, the longer you don't do it, you lose that edge a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. That way, if the steel doesn't actually sharpen your knife, all it's doing is bringing back your original edge that you had. But the quicker you can bring that back, the better off you are.
Great.
Yep.
And when it comes to sharpening knives, if that's something you do at home, how does one go about that?
Well, again, personally, I'm not a real good knife sharpener. As much as I've tried it over the years. I get a good stone, probably a whetstone, and don't put too much of an angle on it. That's where a lot of people make the mistake. They'll angle too much. Keep it pretty flat. But yeah, there's a lot better knife sharpeners out there than me.
Fair enough. And when you buy your knives, is there anything in particular you're looking for? For instance, this one has a wood handle. Is that just a personal preference?
Yeah, this one was. Yeah, I used to buy these by the dozen, and this was actually been around a long time. I'm trying to think of a company like Victorinox. They make a black plastic one, very popular in the meat industry. They're probably about $10-12, I suppose, for one. Again, a 6-inch curved boning knife will really, really benefit you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I noticed that as you talk about it, you've kind of pressed it against the board. So when you're maybe picking out your knife, do you need to see a certain amount of flexibility?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as flexible as a fillet knife, we'll say, but it's not much stiffer, really. It's pretty pliable. Yeah, that way you can keep working the edges, get in there by the bone. Yeah.
Gotcha. I'm trying to think of any other questions. Julie, do you have anything that you can think of that maybe a beginner might want to know? Not really. Yeah, I can't think of anything either.
No.
I'm trying to think of like common mistakes too.
And don't be afraid. Just dive in, really. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Really, if you wreck a couple pieces or you cut them too small, make 2 small steaks into one, you know. It's just, again, it's trial and error. Don't be afraid to get your hands in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So dive right in, keep your eye on time and temperature, and sanitize before you work, get a good knife, and keep that edge going.
It'll help, you bet.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've learned a lot. I really appreciate you coming out today.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.